Good afternoon and welcome to the 28th annual exhibit of hydrogen fuel cell technology. This is going to be a Roundup presentation. You should, while the seats are still available, come here and take advantage of the free drinks. We'll be discussing what has taken place over the course of 2022. There's a lot to talk about. As an exception to the rule, I myself am here not simply as someone who moderates a guest, but as someone who is going to be struggling with the thought behind what is going on. And I do this with my friend and colleague who has been exhibiting here for ages and ages. We did a Roundup in 2017. It had well over 5,000 clicks. It's one of those popular videos. And it's popular because Milburn, whom I'm about to introduce, happens to know more about this industry than just about anyone here, simply because he provides the heart and soul, the innards of the PEM industry, among other things, and this gives him an insider's look at what's going on. But we are going to talk about politics. We're going to be rude. We're going to tell you like it is. We're not going to avoid all of those controversies. And this is one of the problems, actually, to find a guest who can actually do this. And this is Ski Milburn, who is CEO of Eberspächer Vairex. Welcome, Ski.
Thank you, Brian. You know, I've gotten in a lot of trouble for this because sometimes I tell the truth a little too much, and I'm probably never get a job in the diplomatic corps as a result.
Well, you know, there you have it, diplomat. You know, we have a diplomat in Germany who represents Ukraine, and he is famous for being undiplomatic because he has to. It's his job. And I think we need some negotiation here about how we're not necessarily saying where some of the shortcomings in the development of this industry are occurring. But let's talk about the general trends, first of all. We're dealing with renewable energy. Hydrogen does not exist. You know, you don't get it in a bag. You can't fish for it in an ocean. You have to produce it. And you have to produce it with electricity. This all depends on the electrolyzers that split that water molecule and give us the hydrogen. So basically, we are an electricity-dependent initiative here. So what are the problems already at that stage?
Wow, well, that's a big one. So, you know, hydrogen comes in 1,000 colors. We got green hydrogen and purple hydrogen and blue hydrogen and brown hydrogen, but the one we want in the long run is green. So in the meantime, we're going to make hydrogen every way we can because the demand is exploding. And in the long run, we're going to make all of our hydrogen from electricity that came from renewables. And the scale of that effort is almost unimaginable. We're talking about, well, think about this. You drive around Germany, you drive around the United States where I live. Think about all the gasoline stations, all the oil refineries, all the oil pumps and fields and things that you see as you drive around. The hydrogen industry over the next 30 years will grow from almost nothing to something of that physical scale, machinery that's that big. The Chinese are talking about electrolyzers the size of soccer stadiums, and you know, which is basically the size of a small oil refinery. And so we're talking about capital, we're talking about fundamental change in the geopolitical economics of energy, but mostly we're talking about scale, like gargantuan, starship scale, stuff that you almost can't imagine. And yet you'll see here in this show, a lot of electrolyzer companies, a lot of people want a piece of that business. And I like that. But I also don't discount the challenges of scaling something this fast, this big.
And the pressures that are there in order to do this. You know, several of you probably live here in Germany, and you realize what's happened recently. Your energy bill has gone up substantially. It's probably going to continue to do that. The supply for natural gas is at the whim of a dictator from Russia who could turn it off. That's 50% of the natural gas being supplied to Germany. Natural gas is important, actually, when you think of hydrogen, because the great source of hydrogen prior to the renewable energy has always been natural gas. You can actually, it's a hydrocarbon, right? So you remove the carbon and you wind up with hydrogen. That's a messy proposition, but actually, when you looked at the evolution of PEM cell manufacturing, they were less particular about where you get the hydrogen from. They were more particular about what you could do with the PEM cell. So what has changed is, Germany has no notion of energy security. This is vital to a country of this nature with such a large manufacturing base. And it's also vital to a country that has built-in infrastructure. Half of the homes and apartments in Germany have the classical, what the Germans call Gasetagenheizung, right? So it's all run on natural gas. Well, you can't simply shift to electricity or hydrogen. There's going to be a lot of also retooling from the bottom up. And what's supposed to fuel this? It's supposed to be fueled by, if we want green hydrogen, we need green electricity. What's slowing this thing down, Ski? Because we've been here, like I've been here for 20 years, we've been here for 28 years talking about hydrogen and fuel cells, and the engineer's dream is renewable energy, produce hydrogen, use it, and nothing but water comes out, right? How come it's taken us so long to get to this? Just 1% of the hydrogen consumed these days is actually green hydrogen. The rest is all based on other classical hydrocarbons. Why are we so slow?
Well, one of the reasons we're so slow is because it's so big. It turns out that 1% is a massive number. And so you have to think about that. Now, in my personal life, I got out of college during the Arab oil embargo. Most of you are too young to remember such a thing. But what it taught me right at the very beginning of my career was that energy efficiency was important, but energy security was the thing. That was what really, really mattered. For instance, I'm going to ask you all today, what is the value of 1,000 cubic feet of Russian natural gas that you can't or should not buy? And what is the value of something that replaces it? So in my world, I grew up during the Arab oil embargo. We had gas lines. We had gasoline cost $2 a gallon. We thought it was the end of the world. People were standing in line for hours to get gasoline. And one of the things we noticed, and I started a solar company back in those days, was that fossil fuels have a really interesting two-edged sword. What we're doing, fossil fuels are fossilized sunlight. What we're doing is we took hundreds of millions of years of sunlight that got converted into plants, that got converted into rocks and juice, things we call coal and oil, and we're burning it all in a few hundred years. Now, what could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? Well, a little thing like climate change and urban air quality, that might be wrong. It also turns out there's a question for us all, and I finally found the answer, which was, how come all the oil ended up in bad places, like Russia and the Middle East and Texas, where I come from? And
a bad place.
And the more you think about it, what you realize is that kind of wealth concentration, people in Texas who were basically farmers and ranchers and pretty good people discovered you could poke a hole in the ground and money would come shooting out. And that makes you stupid and a little bit arrogant. Because these guys thought they were genius. It's like, oh my God, I'm a genius. I used to drive around my pickup truck with my dog, and now money's flying out of the ground. And so now I drive around my Cadillac with my dog. And so I think the actual tie is that the kind of incredible concentration, 1 billion years of sunlight fossilized into a few hundred years of burning black stuff, turns out that it's bad for people. It's bad for societies. It's bad for the people that are standing underneath that fountain of money. And here's what we also learned in the early days of solar energy. More sunlight falls, more energy falls on every square inch of this earth than humans could ever consume. It's hard to imagine how you could actually consume all the energy that nature's bounty just rains on our head. And you can say, oh, well, it's Germany, it's cloudy, we don't get much sun. You still get more than you can use because that sun is the sunshine, but it also powers the wind, which is where the wind comes from. And it also powers the waves, which is where wave energy comes from. And so it's hard to imagine what happens geopolitically instead of having this incredible economic force concentrated in a few very specific places, like natural gas that we burn in Germany today. What if it was everywhere? It completely changes the way you think about everything. It changes banking. It changes money flows. The United States has 15 aircraft carrier groups. They cost $5 billion each to operate every year. And they basically exist to keep the Straits of Hormuz open so that America and Europe and Japan have access to oil from the Middle East. What happens when you don't spend that money? What else could you buy? Schools, roads, internet, I don't know, stuff.
So I love this. Like, there's the American perspective here, accumulation of wealth and what it does to economies and even politics. We won't go there right away, but we'll get there soon. And you would think, okay, so there's the classic American case. I'm a German patriot, but at the same time, do you voters in Germany know that your government has been lying to you about several factors involved in the energy usage? We have heard for about a dozen years and more that you have to shut down coal-fired electricity generation because of the CO2 output. It's a lot more efficient if you use natural gas, right? Haven't they been telling us even recently that natural gas is a transitionary fuel on the way to something cleaner, so let's use natural gas. At the same time, when the Americans decided to boycott Nord Stream 2 and block the completion of that, the German media told us this is all because the Americans wanted to sell us their dirty fracking gas, right? So we got that right, dirty fracking gas, it's bad. The coal-fired thing. Now, here's the joke behind all of this. When you do the equation of, because isn't this all about greenifying everything? Isn't this all about clean energy? So the equation is kind of simple. They burn a kilowatt of natural gas here in Germany and a kilowatt of coal in Germany and compare the CO2 output and say, oh, there's more CO2 in coal. What they don't tell you is how much methane, 70 times more powerful as a global warming gas, how much methane is vented from the source and its production site on the way to Germany. And that equation means that it was never true, the politicians know this, it was never true that coal is worse than natural gas. Worse, though, is this, and like, I'm all for this critique of America, but there's something strangely anti-American about this. I'm not an American. When they say dirty fracking gas. Why? Because the venting of methane in that chain of producing fracking gas, creating LNG, shipping it off to Germany is actually less of a climate danger than simply using the stuff that comes via pipeline from Germany. It's all counterintuitive, isn't it? But this is why I find it interesting. What has happened is, and everyone in Germany knows this, what was the guy's name? His name was Altmaier. And what did he say? Oh, sorry, folks. You know, all of these wind turbines are noisy, so you can't build them close to people's homes because there's vibration. These studies were all debunked later on. But the final thing is it actually flattened the wind turbine industry in this country. It just decimated the industry, which was a cutting-edge industry. And now all of a sudden it has to come back. What I am suggesting, though, is we have forestalled the development of renewable energy and its application in hydrogen. As soon as you get more electrical energy than the grid can absorb, you do stuff with it. And this is where it gets interesting. And the final, of course, tale they will tell you is, look at how expensive renewable energies are. Look at the price per kilowatt hour of renewable energy, and look at what's happening at your budget at home. We are competitive. 2017 was the year where all of the electrolysis companies were talking about fossil fuel parity. That is, for the quantity of energy you want, we are competitive with fossil fuels. 2017, what has happened in between? Renewables have gotten less expensive and hydrocarbons have gotten more expensive. So we are really, for me, it's interesting because the political discourse doesn't like to look backward, it likes to look forward. But I think a little bit of skepticism about how fast they want to move is necessary. We have to keep on our toes about what they're up to. How positive are you? I mean, this is a cynical take, but what I'm saying is, yes, there has been a change in mentality. Well, it only took a war. And all of a sudden, this potential risk of having to dramatically evolve our energy production in a short period of time. That's going to be a catastrophe if it happens, because there's going to be shortfalls.
Well, number one, since I'm an American, we hate it when these filthy, stinking Europeans say that we're not perfect, because of course we are.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course we're not, even close. But here's what happened in my state, in Colorado, is that we've had a pretty aggressive renewable portfolio standard. We're pushing wind and solar hard. We have a good resource for both. And about 10 years ago, people said renewables are too expensive, and they always will be. And at the time, I was on the board of the Colorado Solar Energy Association for a long time. And we were in cahoots with the wind guys to build out a lot of renewable energy in Colorado. And our local electric utilities, kind of big monopoly that runs most of our state, said, this will never be cheaper than coal. So we got to keep our coal plants. And they wanted to build a really big one. They called Cherokee 3. You don't need to remember that name, but one of the biggest coal plants in the world's in Colorado. And we fought that thing tooth and claw. Don't build it. By the time, long before you pay for it, it'll be obsolete. They built it anyway. And of course, they wanted us to pay a higher electric rate because it was so expensive. It cost billions of dollars to build this thing. So they did. And we were mad, but what are you going to do? Well, then what happened was we kept building more wind and more solar, and every year we have this auction where providers of renewable energy offer energy to the electric utility. Well, then what happened one year was the electricity that came was as cheap as the electricity that came from the coal plant. And under our rules, under the public utility, our utility had to buy it because they are absolutely forced by law to buy the lowest cost electricity. And so suddenly it was cheaper than the fully amortized cost of running the coal plant and the maintenance and the cost of the coal and everything. And so we kept going and we kept building, and the price kept coming down. Today, the last auction we just had, wind energy in Colorado is cheaper than the cost of the coal to run the power plant. So our electric utility says, well, that's not fair because we're not getting the amortization to recover the cost of building this thing. We've only paid for half of it, so how are we going to pay the other half? So I was part of this group in the Society Energy Association that we were limited in how much solar we could build because we were limited by how much we could shut down the coal plant, because as long as the coal plant provided a certain amount of power, we couldn't take it away. It was sort of baked in, right? So we get tax credits from the state for building solar, so we went to the Public Utility Commission and we said, I'll tell you what you'll do. We will give you, Xcel, our utility, we'll give you half of the solar credits if you promise to use the money to retire the coal plant early. And so we're sharing, so we're getting $1,000 a kilowatt hour, and we're giving $5 for every kilowatt we install, and we're giving half of it to the public utility so they shut the coal plant down early. And, well, we built so much solar that we paid off the coal plant. So what did the utility do? They said, oh, now that it's fully amortized, it's so profitable to run this thing, we can't stop. So now we're fighting over how soon we get to shut them off. But the point is, you can scale your renewables. And I want to talk about something, and Brian's going to interrupt me if I talk too long, but what happens is we're creating, and we're in the early stages, but we're creating a two-tier market for electricity. There's a market for and you won't like these prices, but I think electricity is expensive in Colorado. It costs about 15 US cents per kilowatt hour. It's about half of what you pay in Germany. And so there's two kinds of electricity now. There's electricity that's supplied to the grid when you want it, and there's electricity that's available for supply when you don't want it. And the price step between those two kinds of electricity is about 4 to 1. Now, the magic of that is that means you've got electricity that's available at about, electricity when you don't want it is worth about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, you go around here and talk to all the electrolyzer companies in the hall today, and all their models say at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, our electrolyzer builds hydrogen cheaper than diesel fuel. And that's absolutely true, but at 30 cents a kilowatt hour, not so much. And so I think what's happening is we need to massively overbuild renewable energy, like 4 times as much as you think we need. The scale is almost unimaginable. And when we do that, you have all the electricity you ever need to run everything you do electrically, and enough leftover cheap electricity that you can afford to run these electrolyzers enough of the time that you can actually pay for them, because they're really expensive machines to just have sitting around doing nothing. You need to run them a lot, right? So this is all possible, but you can't do it in 6 months, which is had we started 20 years ago in Germany, we'd be there now, but we didn't, and so here we are.
There's a parallel to that story, of course. The coal-fired electrical generation plants in Germany, well, they were phased out, of course, for the wrong reason. You could have gone straight to hydrogen, but instead of that, they decided to build natural gas electrical plants. But the government paid over €1 billion to the operators of the coal-fired plants to shut them down. Because you have a lifetime expectancy of these units, and if the government mandates that you shut them down, someone's going to pay the bill, and of course it's you people, the taxpayers, right? So I don't know if there's any Russians here. There was a big phrase, go back to the Soviet era, when they were talking about elektrifikacja всего народа. So it's like the electrification of the entire nation. When we talk about hydrogen, green hydrogen, sometimes you slip into this term electrification. Because basically what it is renewable energy, which is in its initial stage, in most forms, in most cases, it's direct to electricity. And then you have, okay, so what do you do with it? The obvious thing is electrolysis, because you can't store electrical energy at this scale, right? There's no batteries big enough, so you have to do something with it. You put it into hydrogen, and there you have a start. And here we get into this big debate that people have, and I find there's something about the fuel cell and hydrogen energy community here. You see them again and again going down on their knees. Oh, I'm sorry. As soon as you mention efficiency, oh, it's like 86% efficient, or it's, only 72% efficient, but we're working on it. All of this, I call it an efficiency lie, because we're comparing ourselves to what? And even more drastic is my lack of knowledge, which I've seen this year. Once you get the hydrogen, what do you do with it? And of course, for those of you who are, involved in chemistry, you can create from hydrogen methanol, you can make ammonia, you can do a pile of other things. What I did not know is how actually efficient that is. If you do a value chain, you can create methanol, and it's really a small fraction of energy loss by compared with the electrolysis in the first place. Now, why this is important is because we're always thinking of applications. I don't know how long on this fair we were always talking about pressurized tanks, a 700 bar, 300 bar, and it's like you're always competing. This was the age when everyone thought we're going to build cars, right? The Toyotas here and other people, and the sexy vehicles, and we're going to build cars. And the big thing was, of course, that it does the electrical vehicle because it travels further. But it may not be the best equation in terms of you can do other things with the gas itself. But let's get back to this. Oh, by the way, I'm getting so worked up about this topic because I'm angry.
Bring some beer.
We get a shot of beer to keep ourselves cool. Let's get back to this electrification notion and the question of efficiency and why this industry should stop saying that we are inefficient by comparison with the combustion industry.
Oh, well, I could go on forever, so don't let me. But so here's one of the things that occurs to me is that now I'm going to talk from my commercial interests for a moment, because Eberspächer, who acquired my company last year, you always knew me, those of you that know me, knew me as Vairex, a Colorado company that makes cathode air compressors. We were acquired by a big German auto parts maker, Eberspächer. So I'm now half German. And we have two basic fundamental approaches to the hydrogen industry, and one is fuel cells, and that's the part I'm in. But the other is diesel engines running on hydrogen, kind of like diesel engines converted to run on natural gas or some of these other fuels. And I've got friends of mine in the hydrogen business who say that's such a terrible waste of wonderful hydrogen to burn it in a diesel engine because it's so inefficient. And it is. It's half the efficiency, half the thermal efficiency of a fuel cell. But here's the thing: if it's cheaper than diesel fuel, who cares? and you also hear, well, hydrogen, it takes more energy to make a kilo of hydrogen that's in a kilo of hydrogen. Well, duh. Did you know that it takes more oil, more energy in the form of crude oil to make a gallon of diesel fuel that's in a gallon of diesel fuel? It does. In fact, the efficiency of converting oil to diesel fuel is not very good. And then you burn in an engine that's not very good. And so Brian talks about the efficiency trap. And I think what happened was, in the early days, fuel cells are really expensive, hydrogen's really expensive, and so we're really chasing efficiency. We have to be maximum efficiency, maximum efficiency, maximum efficiency to have any chance at all to being competitive. But we're now entering a world, it might take 10 or 20 more years to get there, but we're entering this world where hydrogen does get less expensive than fossil fuels. And suddenly, if it's less expensive, do you really care? I mean, right now, the capital cost per kilowatt of a diesel engine is really low compared to a fuel cell. If the fuel costs less and the engine costs less, there are operators who will say, that's what I'm going to do. Even though I could use half as much hydrogen to do the same job in my truck, but the truck's cheaper. And I'm not here to tell you that's a bad thing, even though I've been in the fuel cell industry my whole life. It's like, that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing.
It gets to the point of applications and affordability. I mean, you can retrofit a lot of vehicles simply to run on hydrogen. And people, the guys from Air Liquide, the gas specialists, they used to tell me, you know, I cry when I hear people burning hydrogen, simply because there's a lot more energy in there. But there's another equation, that is, we have all of these conventional vehicles. Are they going to disappear overnight just because they don't have batteries in them or a fuel cell? Can we afford to trash them and replace them with an electric drivetrain, or just write them off? And so all of these transitionary stages should not be dependent on maximizing efficiency. There's another issue, and this is getting, my colleague Jos was just on the stage here, and he was talking about things like logistics, so also trucks, but forklift trucks and things like that. There's another side to this issue. And it is environmental, but it's sort of underestimated as we underestimate methane. Let me give you two strategies here. One is most of the products coming from China to North America arrive in California. They're put on trucks, and they're taken from California off to places like Chicago. And that line on the map, that road, is called Cancer Alley. And it's because the incidence of cancers rise there. And yeah, someone is coughing already. It's me. So it's one of the environmental sides, but it's one of the environmental sides that people are unaware of here. That is, because of European legislation, I've been ratting on Germany all the time, as you've been doing for the United States, but something positive, European legislation has said, okay, they have something called Feinstaub. So fine particular, what is it called? Exhaust.
Particulate?
Fine particulate.
Oh, yeah. Fine particulate matter.
Okay, yeah. Coming from, among other things, diesel vehicles, and also simply the other gases that are not good for the human being. They reach such levels in German cities that you can sue the mayor and say, shut down traffic. And this is addressed to you and to other people who think about this, because, in fact, there's legislation in power right now that are going to force us to electrify all of the logistics, every delivery vehicle, the people who run the garbage trucks, the post-delivery, and so on. And particularly this relationship to a single refueling station, which makes the development of a grid for refueling these vehicles, however they're constructed, is more tenable because you have a fleet of buses going back to the same place. And by the way, the added perspective there is also, do the Italians want those dirty diesel engines going to the ports? And no, they don't. What about the fjords? Can you take a cruise ship and just simply enter into the beautiful Scandinavian landscape there in a conventional ship? No, these are the big markets right now, and I'm saying right now, and it's driven not necessarily primarily by affordability, although that is what we're working towards, but also by things like emissions. And I think the boat you mentioned, you're sitting in the audience, the moderator here, is part of this. Who wants a diesel boat with the noise and then the emissions tugging through the city? It's one of the ways that the Europeans have parsed that. I don't know if there was a comparison to the United States, but
there is.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's the same everywhere. You know, our ports and our airports are some of the filthiest places from an urban air quality point of view that we have in the world. They're actually dangerous places to be. And, you know, and so we're seeing ground support equipment go to hydrogen. Certainly in indoor warehouses, the thing that really built my business was COVID. We saw our business double in about the first 6 months of COVID because in the push to online everything, people realized you couldn't run, we outlawed propane. You couldn't run propane indoors anymore. I think the Germans thought of that first. And then people discovered that you couldn't run batteries 24 hours a day. You'd change the batteries 3 times a day. That was kind of a hassle, kind of a problem. And so in the world of forklifts, indoor logistics, the cost of hydrogen is high, the cost of fuel cells are high, but the productivity increase of not having to change the battery 3 times a day makes up all the difference. And so when COVID hit and we went to online everything, pretty much I stopped going to the store for 2 years. I can buy everything online. Those companies, Walmart and Amazon in particular, just exploded. And we went from a world where they were deciding if they were going to buy 50 forklifts to a world where they decided they would call up my customer and say, ship as many as you can. And of course, it all goes downhill, so I get the same thing. And our business exploded, at which point we were like, we either raise a bunch of money or we sell the company. And in the end, we sold to Eberspächer because now we have automotive scale company that with the kind of capital resources and manufacturing facilities that we can actually scale to that level. But it was a huge hit. And it wasn't driven by pollution per se. It was driven by human productivity. Different reason.
Human productivity and a catastrophe.
In the midst of a catastrophe.
In the midst of a catastrophe. I mean,
if Brian lets me, we're going to talk about catastrophe here in a minute, but.
Okay, we'll do that. Actually, we could enter into that topic, but this is one of, like, the catastrophe factor is already, we're at the gate, right? There's a war going on. People tend not to repetitively say, well, this is related to our gas supply, and in fact, it's involved in why this war happened. It's a fundamental problem within Germany that the energy supply in a country that is the #1 per capita exporting nation in the world, the energy supply is all foreign. You're a net exporter, right? So,
well, we didn't used to be, but now we are.
Yeah, exactly.
With the dirty fracking stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, however one looks at that, the problem, though, is actually contingency. When I say contingency, what I mean is from what do you depend, and how easy is it to have control over what's happening. And this is like a COVID epidemic, just with another field of activities going on in the background. The labile nature of energy is going to hit us. It has hit us, and changes are coming quickly. But you wanted to go to the catastrophe scenario.
We're going to do that for a second. But before I do that, I will say this, because it's kind of a lead into it. Here in Germany, and since I'm half German, I can talk about this. I didn't used to be, but I am now. we find ourselves in the uncomfortable position of financing both sides of a war that's destroying a neighboring European country called Ukraine. And we're financing the Russians, who are using the money to buy bombs and bullets and things. And of course, we're also financing the Ukrainians by giving them weapons and bombs and bullets and things. And it's kind of not a great situation to find yourself in, is that a neighboring country of people that we know and love is being destroyed by a war that we're paying for both sides of. And that's not cool. So that goes back to my whole thing about the concentration of fossil fuels versus the economic distribution of renewables, and of which hydrogen is a key piece. But I want to talk about disruption for a few moments at the end here, because I think this is also fundamental to what we all face. Is in a history of technology and companies, there's technological disruption. For example, the cell phones replaced the wired phones. And cars and trucks replaced the railroads, and the railroads replaced the canals, and so on throughout human history. You know, the Gutenberg Bible put a whole lot of monks out of work who spent their lives copying Bibles by hand. And of course, it changed the world, because suddenly, instead of having a Bible being so expensive that only a pretty good-sized city could only afford one, and you went to church where the priests would read to you the parts they wanted you to know, to a world where within 100 years, everybody that wanted one could have one and read it for themselves. And that led to the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and a whole bunch of radical things that happened in the way people perceive their relationship to the church and to God and to society. Well, what we're seeing right now is the same thing is happening to the automobile industry. The technical foundation of the automobile industry, which is the same technical foundation as the trucking and shipping industry, which is the internal combustion engine running on fossil fuels, which, by the way, is the same technical foundation in a different way of the steel industry, which runs on coal, and the chemical industry, which runs on oil and natural gas. And I could go on and on here for the rest of the afternoon, and I'd rather go drink beer. All of that is being overturned. And when that happens, most of the industries that were the incumbents, and this includes my company, are at risk of disruption and dissolution. And in fact, what you see if you study history is that very few of the incumbents before a technological disruption remain in business after the. In fact, the number is so small that it's almost like the exceptions prove the rule. And of course, one of the reasons Eberspächer acquired Vairex, and one of the reasons I'm so passionate about being in this position, is that we're trying to keep that from happening to this company, and by extension to our economy and our world and our politics. But here's what's happening, which is really, I call it disruption to the nth power, is that we're not just being disrupted by technological innovation. How many cell phone companies were twisted pair wire phone companies? You know, not very many. And around the world, almost none. But we also have COVID, which has gone from pandemic to endemic. COVID is now essentially with us forever. It's not going away. We might say, well, I'm done with Corona. And it's like, yeah, but Corona's not done with you. And so, by the way, the Spanish flu, I'm not old enough to remember. Maybe some of you guys are. Spanish flu killed a huge percentage of the world back in the early 1900s. And you know what? Spanish flu never went away. If you get a flu shot every year, I do, most people in Germany do, one of the things that's in that flu shot is a vaccine for Spanish flu. And by the way, Spanish flu didn't start in Spain. It started in Kansas. And so we have a second disruption, which is a pandemic, which has become endemic, which has changed all of our lives in some important way forever. We also have this transition from concentrated sources of fossil fuel to distributed sources of renewable energy. It's going to change everything. The world financial system will be completely fundamentally disrupted by this. And then we have this little business of supply chain. You hear a lot of people here over the last few days talking about how hard it is to get parts, and things are late, and lead times are long, and some things are not available at any price, at any time. That's another kind of disruption. And now we have this thing called war. You want the ultimate disruptor is we're suddenly fighting World War III, World War II Part 2, not far from here. I mean, you could, if it wasn't for the war going on, you can drive to Ukraine from here in less than a day. That's how close it is. When I was landing in Frankfurt and you're looking at the little map on the seat back in front of you, you can see Frankfurt and Kiev in the same map. I mean, it's close. You could almost go to the bar on the top floor of a hotel and watch the bombs going off. It's that close. And so what I'm calling this is disruption to the nth power. Is there more forms of disruption happening simultaneously than the human race, I think, has ever faced? You know, for example, just a little thing, but most of the bread that you eat in Germany is made from wheat that was grown in Ukraine. And around the world, Ukrainian wheat is one of the things that keeps the third world alive. And those ships aren't leaving Ukraine right now. They can't. The harbors are full of Russian mines. And so we've got a climate change thing. There's roughly 1 billion people in Bangladesh that are going to be leaving soon enough because of the rising sea levels are bringing seawater into the cropland and they can't grow crops anymore, so they got to go somewhere else. And so I don't want to leave you with a bad thought, because we're going to win this, we're going to overcome this, and we have a path, and this industry and this room is part of the path, but it's a huge, huge challenge for the human race to learn to deal with a massive relocation of billions of people, massive relocation of fundamental resources, disruption of practically everything in this complex web that we think of as civilization. I flew here in an Airbus. And that Airbus was powered by a jet fuel, which was pumped from the ground, probably in Texas or someplace. And can you imagine if you were back to the, you know, sticks and stones level, what it would take to build another A350? Oh yeah, you got to create an aluminum industry, an electronics industry, a fossil fuel industry, a gas turbine engine industry from scratch. And so losing that web, having it fall to pieces before our eyes, is a fundamental existential threat to everything we think we know about what it means to be human. And look at the clothes we're wearing. If you had to make these clothes yourself from nothing, what would we look like today? If all the food we ate, you had to dig from the ground in the ground that surrounds your own house, right? And so I leave you with this thought that this is a phenomenal challenge. It's also probably the biggest economic opportunity in history, which is this, what we called in America, the overturning plow. John Deere invented a plow that took the tall grass prairie in the great American Midwest, a piece of farmland big enough to put all of Europe inside with room left over, and they turned the soil over and exposed the roots to the sky, and they proceeded to grow crops, the biggest bonanza of farming in the history of the human race. And 30 years later, it created this thing called the Dust Bowl, and you couldn't grow anything there for a long, long time. But it also created an incredible expansion of agriculture, and so we've survived that. And we will survive this. And the amount of opportunity and possibility for younger people, my kids are in their 30s, is phenomenal. But I leave you with this. We live our own lives for ourselves, but we live our lives for our grandchildren and their grandchildren and their grandchildren. And this is a time to think about our grandchildren's grandchildren. So I want to thank you very much for listening. And Brian may have a closing comment. But thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for having enough faith in the future. And don't give up.
So I am going to add a concluding remark, simply because what our friend and colleague here has just done is basically undress us and take us back to the Stone Age as one potential outcome of this crisis, and then provide us with some of the people here are in tears, I hope you realize. We need a sense of hope here, and it's, let me take Germany for the example. They've already made the decision that we can build wind turbines wherever we want. So what he just suggested, distributing energy production has a wonderful democratizing effect upon energy itself. And that itself is part of the equation that we're looking at, which is if you decentralize energy production, not simply the efficiencies, but the democratization that can occur, despite the fact that we'll still need to, if you talk to the German experts, import hydrogen from other places. There's going to be so much of it. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and the light is kind of large. When you look at the automobile industry and you talk to the geeks who produce electric cars, and they say, "Oh, we're ready for production" or whatever, and then you talk to the people who are professionals, the scientists from the electrolysis industry, they simply say, "Okay, if you want to replace all of the standard combustion engine cars with electric cars, you're going to need so much for the batteries that you'll be mining for the next 300 years." That is, people are not necessarily telling you it's not tenable to do that. But what about creating hydrogen from renewable energy? Interesting. Go and talk to the people who do electrolysis. 15 years ago, you couldn't find an electrolysis booth here, and now the majority of space that is occupied at this fair is electrolysis. And these guys will tell you flat out, sure, it's possible. That is, the problem with harvesting renewable energy is electricity has to be used or it's gone. It needs to be stored. And the ability to create an alternative to what are the hydrocarbons of today is something that is a tenable proposition. It needs advocacy, and it needs people like Ski Milburn who has some hope, and grandchildren. So with that, I'm going to close our conversation today. I'd like to thank everyone for their patience, listening to two old fogies like us rant about the current status of the world and how things have to change radically, but they do. Yeah, so I've been talking to Ski Milburn, who's CEO of Eberspächer Vairex, and we'll be back next year, I'm sure. Thank you.